One of the popular things you see around Christmas time is Nativity Scenes. I always called them manger scenes until I found out the real name is Nativity Scene. It's one of my favorite things at Christmas is to see those. Now we have a number of those at home. Wanda has a cousin who's a retired nurse, and she used to go on a lot of mission trips to different countries. She'd always bring us one back, a small one. Some of them are only about like that at the time. And then we have one from Africa that's carved out of a piece of wood that opens up. Some of them are bigger ones that you sit on tabletops. And of course, people have life-size ones. You know, they have the figures sitting outside. Today, I thought it would be interesting to look at nativity scenes and the history of them. Back before there were nativity scenes with the figures in them, of course, artists have drawn pictures of the birth of Jesus. One of the earliest ones that has survived is not a picture, though. It's a carving. It is the top of a sarcophagus. That's a stone coffin. And this thing is thought to date from the 300s from Italy. And it shows the birth of Jesus. It shows only the baby, an ox, and a donkey. Mary and Joseph are absent from that one. And that was the thing about the earliest depictions of the birth of Jesus. A lot of times Mary and Joseph were absent. But there was an ox and a donkey. Now, if you're familiar with the birth stories in Luke and Matthew, you know that an ox and donkey are not mentioned. But it comes from something from the book of Isaiah. The book of Isaiah said, "The ox knows his owner, and the donkey his master's crib." And ancient Christians felt that passage referred to Jesus, and so they developed the idea that there should be an ox and a donkey in the scene. And they attached a meaning to that, meaning that one represented Jews and one represented non-Jews. And this meant that Jesus did not come just for the Jews, but he came for all people, everyone in the world. And so during the 300s, it was not unusual to see artist renderings of the birth of Jesus with just Jesus, an ox, and a donkey. By the 400s, though, Mary begins to appear in the scenes. And back then, in the earliest depictions, she is sort of laying down. Most of them have her sort of laying down, propped up on one arm on the side. And that apparently was to indicate that she was exhausted from giving birth. Now, it was not until the 13 and 1400s that Mary was pictured as kneeling. And in most all nativity scenes now, she is shown kneeling at the side of the manger, looking at the baby, with her hands in some kind of prayer pose, indicating that she is praying. Now, the origin of the three-dimensional nativity scenes with figures or animals and people in them dates back to the year 1223 and a man named St. Francis of Assisi. He is known in Roman Catholicism as the patron saint of animals and nature, and he was credited with creating the first nativity scene with people and animals in the town of Greccio, Italy. Now, that was a small town built on a mountainside, and it had a tiny church in it. And Francis was the priest there, and it was coming up Christmas Eve. And he knew a lot of people would be coming to church on Christmas Eve. He knew they'd all have a hard time fitting into that church. And he knew that for most people, Christmas didn't really have a lot to do with the birth of Jesus. It was just a celebratory time. So he wanted to do something that would really remind people and stick with them, to remind them what Christmas was all about. He decided he would hold his Christmas Eve Mass outside, and he found a small cave near town that was sort of an inset in the rocks, and he set up an altar for the Mass there. There would be plenty of room that people could gather around. And then he decided to set up a scene to recreate what he thought the birth of Jesus might have looked like. He put down hay and got a man and woman to play Mary and Joseph, and he got a wax figure to represent the baby Jesus. And he brought in the donkey and the ox. And this is the first known nativity scene like that. And he sent word to people that when they came to Mass that night, they should bring some kind of light, either a lantern, a candle, or a torch or something. He wanted to light up the night to remind people of the star that gathered around and showed the three kings where Jesus was. He wanted to remind people of the shepherds out in the field. And he wanted to remind people that it said, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, the shepherds in the field. And so people came and they brought their lights and they had Mass. And people saved that hay from the manger. And they claimed that when they fed it to sick cows, the cows were cured. Now, having this nativity scene like this was so popular that word got out, and eventually it wasn't long until people were having them all over. And at first they were used with human beings and animals, or real living manger scenes, but in the years to come it would be traditional to use figures instead of the living people. And they eventually developed into small portable scenes. They were used in churches and homes and public places. And eventually the addition of other figures, other animals, and other people became common. Now, different areas developed their own specific styles for their nativity scenes. And traditionally it was thought to have one, you needed to have one made in Italy because that's where they started. And so many were made in Italy. I have one at home that my grandmother bought me back in the 1960s, and it's stamped on the bottom of it, made in Italy. Now, the Italian term for a nativity scene is presepio. It comes from the Latin word meaning to enclose something. And so that is, a nativity scene is enclosed in something. Most of the ones that we have around here are enclosed in some kind of barn-looking structure. But remember, St. Francis' original nativity scene was in a cave, and that was a reflection of the ancient Christian belief that Jesus' birth happened in a cave. It was apparently common back in that time to stable animals in a cave rather than build a building for them. And the initial Christian belief was that was the case, that in Bethlehem there, the animals were stabled in a cave, and that's where Jesus was born. Now, of course, the Bible does not specify whether it was a cave or a building. It only said that Jesus was laid in a manger. But it was only later in Western Christianity that the idea developed that the stable was actually a building and not in a cave. In Eastern Christianity, it never did develop that way. And even in Eastern Europe, sometimes they look like a broken egg instead of a stable or a building. And you'll have a nativity scene set in something that's egg-shaped, and the front of it would be cracked out like you would crack an egg, and that is supposed to resemble the cave. Now, earliest Christian tradition has it that although the New Testament accounts of the birth of Jesus does not mention it, that there was a midwife present when Jesus was born. A midwife is a woman who assists another woman in childbirth and assists in the care of the newborn infant. Now, in Eastern Christianity, usually in their nativity scenes there is a midwife present, but not in Western Christianity. Now, in addition to the donkey and the ox, there is, in many manger scenes, a sheep present. A sheep became very popular to add. And people attach different meanings to the sheep. Some people say it represents purity, that Jesus was pure. Some say it represents the Lord is my shepherd. And then some say it represents Jesus as the Lamb of God. Now, over the years, people other than Mary and Joseph became common to use. Shepherds and magi were added. This was an attempt to bring together the two accounts of Jesus' birth. The one in Luke talks about the shepherds, The one in Matthew talks about the Magi. According to Luke, the shepherds visited Jesus on the night of his birth. But according to Matthew, the Magi came somewhat later because it says they had to travel a long distance, and when they got to the area, it took a while to find the baby Jesus. So some time had passed from the time Jesus was born until the Magi came. Traditionally in Christianity, that was thought to be 12 days. That's where the song 12 Days of Christmas came from. The Magi was thought to have visited Bethlehem 12 days after the birth of Jesus. Now, in most nativity scenes that use Magi and shepherds, both are present. And that brings up an important point about nativity scenes. They are not intended to be a photograph of what actually happened on the night Jesus was born. They are what is called an iconographic depiction. And that simply means that they are meant to depict the meaning of something. They're not supposed to be a picture of it. And so they're just to depict the meaning. Now be sure and realize it's not to be interpreted as saying that everything you see in a nativity scene happened in one night. And sometimes people take great delight in pointing this out. And around Christmas you always see the stories in the news. You know, those manger scenes that you look at aren't the true story. And I've already seen those in the news this time. The enemies of Christianity will seize on anything they can to lure people away from Christianity. But they don't realize, though, that these nativity scenes are iconographic depictions, not intended to be photographs. Some nativity scenes will depict an angel hovering over the birth of Jesus. Some will depict a star. We have one at home that has a star attached up at the top of the stable. Sometimes you will see the depiction of light in a nativity scene. In some nativity scenes, the characters are painted in some kind of paint color that will make them appear as if they are glowing. Now, sometimes in a nativity scene that's enclosed in something, you'll see a hole cut out in the back where you can put a light through it. Or some of them will even have lights in them where you can turn them on. And that is there to indicate that Jesus is the light of the world. And the light also represents the star that guided the Magi to Jesus. And that is reminding us of what the author of John says, the light shines in the darkness. In all nativity scenes, the baby Jesus should be in the center. That fixes all attention on Jesus. Now, the baby Jesus can be clothed in two ways. One is Jesus is wrapped in swaddling clothes, and there's some disagreement about what exactly that meant. Some say that it was a huge piece of cloth that the baby was more or less rolled up in, sort of like a cocoon type thing. Others say, no, it was just like a diaper type thing. And so you will see in nativity scenes, sometimes the baby Jesus looks like he's rolled up in something, and sometimes you'll see him with just like a diaper on. I looked at the ones we have at home, and the great majority of the ones we have show him just in a diaper instead of being wrapped up in something. Now, a lot of times if you see one in a diaper, you will also see that the baby Jesus is painted in a color that makes it look like that he is glowing. And that comes from the 1300s, from a vision that a woman from Sweden had. She became known as Saint Bridget, and she claimed to have a vision of the birth of Jesus, in which she said that the baby Jesus was glowing after he was born. Now, she wrote a book about a number of different visions she had. She called it Celestial Revelations, and it became popular in Europe. Many of the nativity scenes then after that will show a baby Jesus that looks like he's glowing. Now, we talked about earlier how the idea developed that Mary at first was reclining, like she was exhausted from giving birth, and then she is kneeling beside the manger of Jesus. With Joseph, there are two ways he can be depicted. Sometimes Joseph is shown as standing, and sometimes he also is shown as kneeling at the manger with Mary. Now, we talked about how it was traditional for Mary to be in a prayer pose. The most common one is something like this. We have some that are like this. This is a traditional prayer pose. And there are also some that are like this. This is a traditional prayer pose also. Now, you often see Joseph, if he's standing or even if he's kneeling, you'll see him holding a staff. And that is a staff, that sticks up pretty high. And that does not indicate he was a shepherd. Staffs were carried by men back then for two main reasons. One was it was just sort of like an ornamentation, like carrying a cane or a hat or wearing a hat or something like that. But it was also a useful thing because, back then you had to walk everywhere and there were animals around, and that was going to give you at least some protection should you be set upon by a wild animal. But the real reason that Joseph is sometimes depicted as having a staff goes back to an ancient tradition in Christianity that talks about Mary. And the idea was that Mary was what was called a temple virgin in Jerusalem. And a temple virgin was just a young woman who performed light duty cleaning and service work at the temple. And then when she got to be a certain age, she had to leave that and go on. And so when she got to be a certain age, the temple officials decided they needed to find her a husband. And so they sent word out that they had a temple virgin who was available to be married. And all the men who were interested would come and assemble. And it is said that Joseph was among those. He came and assembled. He was holding a staff. And one tradition says that a dove flew out of the top of his staff. Another tradition says that a dove come and lit on his staff, and that was a signal to the temple officials that Joseph should be Mary's husband. So when you see a nativity scene with Joseph holding a staff, that's where that came from. Now sometimes Joseph is depicted as holding a candle instead of a staff. And that comes from the vision of Saint Bridget of Sweden that we talked about earlier. According to her vision, Joseph did not think it was proper that he should remain in the cave while Mary was giving birth. You remember there was traditionally a midwife in there. So what Joseph did is he came and brought in a candle to light up the cave there, and then he went out so Mary could give birth in private. And then the idea is that after Jesus was born, some kind of divine light shined inside the cave that completely overshadowed the light that Joseph had brought in. Now, in some nativity scenes, Joseph is depicted as holding a lantern instead of a candle. And the lantern does not hark back to St. Bridget's vision. It's just a lantern there just plain to give light. Now, as far as other people is concerned, it is the three magi, or three kings, as they are more commonly called. We usually see three of these in a nativity scene. The Bible doesn't tell us how many there were. It merely says they brought three gifts, and for that reason people think three kings. They are usually dressed in fine, expensive clothes with crowns or big turbans or something on their head. They're in robes and stuff that's obviously expensive. The Bible calls them magi, which literally means magicians. And that was a term applied to people who were thought to be able to read the future from the stars. We would call them astrologers today. It'd be something similar to that. But they were also thought to have the power to change the future. If they read the future and saw something they didn't like, They were thought to have the power to change it. And eventually, it became uncomfortable within Christianity to have people like that associated with the birth of Jesus. And so, sometime in the 700s, these magi began morphing into the three kings. But that was based on a passage found in Psalm 72. It says, all kings will bow down before him. And Christians began interpreting that as referring to Jesus, and they interpreted all kings to refer to one from each continent. And there were three known continents at that time to the people in the area where Jesus lived: Europe, Asia, and Africa. And so the Magi morphed into the three kings. And they are usually depicted as holding a container in which is held the gift that they are bringing. And at least one of them is usually depicted as either bowing or kneeling. And of course that's from Psalm 72, all kings were bowed before him. Sometimes you will see the faces painted to illustrate Europe, Asia, and Africa. We have one at home that has a white person's face. And that one has a sort of a brownish face representing Asia, I guess, and then one with a black face representing Africa. Now keep in mind that the Bible does refer to these people as magi, not kings. And keep in mind, though, that the nativity scene is an iconographic depiction. It's not meant to give a photograph. So you do have some license there. It is meant to bring everything together and depict meaning rather than a photograph. You will often see shepherds in nativity scenes, especially in the larger ones. They are often depicted as boys rather than men. But some nativity scenes have three shepherds: a young one, a middle-aged one, and an elderly one. And those are meant to depict the three stages of life: youth, middle age, and elder. They will sometimes be shown holding stick-like objects, that is a shepherd's rod, and sometimes they will carry a shepherd's flute. Apparently there is a legend that shepherds like to play flutes. Now, there is a contrast between how the magi or kings are dressed and the shepherds are dressed. The magi or kings are usually dressed in finery and expensive looking clothes, while the shepherds are dressed in just poor people's clothes. And that is intended to indicate that both rich and poor come to pay their respects to the baby Jesus. Now, nativity scenes are, as I said, one of my favorite things about Christmas. I always thought from my earliest childhood, Christmas had a sense of mystery to it. And you know, to be honest with you, the sense of mystery did not come as much from the birth of Jesus as it did. I always wondered how Santa Claus got those presents in the house. When I was really, really small, we had a chimney in our house, a fireplace in the living room, and my mother never did like fireplaces. She thought they looked dirty. So she had all that tore out and just a wall put there. And I said, well, how is Santa Claus going to get in? Oh, I'll leave the front door open. But the sense of mystery about Christmas came to me as a child, wondering how Santa Claus got in there with those presents. But as I got older, the sense of mystery detached itself from Santa Claus, and it attached itself to the birth of Jesus. That is the great mystery of Christianity. It is something that Christianity asserts that God came here and became a human being in every way just like us. But yet at the same time, he did not cease to be God. And the way that has been traditionally expressed in Christian theology is Jesus was 100% human, but at the same time 100% divine. And so when we look at the baby in a manger, we're looking at something that we have no idea how it could come about. The great mystery of Christianity. How could God come and become a human being in every way just like us, and yet still remain to be God? It is the unique event in all of human history when God entered into human history and became one of us. And you know, when that happened, it did not happen with the blare of trumpets. It did not happen with a grand procession down Main Street. It happened silently at night in some little corner of the world, and it was only known by a handful of people. It was without fanfare. It was just a little baby was born, and the world never noticed. That's how God came to earth. A little baby was born somewhere, and nobody ever noticed it. That is the great mystery of Christianity. And to me, it has always had that sense of mystery to it. I hope for you it will have a sense of mystery.